Hi folks, and welcome to our video lesson on Comolli and Narboni's essay and the film Sorry to Bother You. I want to begin by simply contextualizing this essay. There was a recent academic conference inspired by this essay in just a few years ago, just to show you that this essay has a lasting impact on the field, and just to give you a sense of how it's contextualized in film studies today. So it writes, part manifesto, part polemic against their critical rivals, and part theoretical elucidation. This article, that is Cinema Ideology Criticism, set the basis for Cahiers du Cinema's activity for the next 5 years, as the journal sought to develop a Marxist approach to the critical analysis of cinema. A short, incisive text whose political stridency transported the ebullient spirit of the May '68 protests into the realm of film theory. So I just want to draw attention to this term, May '68 protests. And this is not a history class, and we don't need to go into the details, but I just want you to understand that you may be reading some secondary sources about film theory and see this year, 1968, signaled as a way of marking a transition from one state of film theory to the next. So what do we mean by May '68? Well, we mean a period of civil unrest that occurred throughout France, lasting about 7 weeks and punctuated by demonstrations, strikes, the occupation of universities and factories. The unrest began with a series of student occupation protests against capitalism, consumerism, American imperialism, and so forth. The protests were countered by police and then led to street battles. And what's known as the Grenelle Accords ended protests and led to wage gain for workers. So there was a slight initial win, a success of the 1968 protests, but equally so, many people consider the May 1968 protests not successful. Partly because in the next election, the Gaullists, those who followed the traditional regime of President Charles de Gaulle, emerged stronger than before. It's true that in the next year, de Gaulle will resign, but generally the protests are considered to be a kind of wavering success. Not wholly successful, but the spirit of the protests and the spirit of countering a traditional regime kind of lasts throughout French culture and really is the center of leftist culture. So we can see a reflection of this historical event in the transition of one of the major producing bodies of film studies and film theory, which is the journal Cahiers du Cinema. Cahiers du Cinema is probably the most famous film journal in the world. Our friend André Bazin was one of its founders, and you can actually give a pretty clear sense of its trajectory through these published volumes that collect some of the most important writings from over a span of 3 decades. So the first volume is called The 1950s Neorealism, Hollywood, and New Wave. So what you're getting there is you're getting André Bazin's celebration of neorealism, but you're also getting the beginnings of auteurism and auteur theory. That is, French critics really interested in a set of auteurists, and I'll get to that in a second. The 1960s are marked by a kind of movement away from this kind of traditional Hollywood-loving auteurism to an interest in new wave cinema. And finally, most important for us are these very pivotal years that begin in 1969 in direct response to the 1968 student protests. And interestingly and importantly, the volume is called The Politics of Representation. In other words, we could say we get a strong political turn in 1969 that really permeates film theory and really goes beyond Cahiers du Cinema. We're going to be reading a famous essay by Laura Mulvey next week that's part of the journal Screen, which is a British journal that is in many ways influenced directly by the kind of theory that's being done at Cahiers du Cinema. Quickly, so we understand what we moved away from, we broke away from auteurism. So that was an obsession partly with classical Hollywood directors like Nicholas Ray, like Alfred Hitchcock, like Howard Hawks. The original idea of auteurism is something like this, that a true auteur is a distinct artistic personality working within the confines of a capitalist system. And if you have the right critical acumen, you can find the elements of their personality and their creative influence despite the fact that they're working within a regime. The other side of film criticism that they've gotten away from is like stuff that we've read. So Andre Bazin's philosophically inflected criticism, a praise of neorealism paired with a philosophical reflection upon the apparatus of cinema, especially its tie to material reality. They wanted to get away from that in 1968, and they were also influenced by these other intellectual spheres. So you may be seeing the same proper names mentioned in a lot of these articles. So Baudry, Comolli, and Narboni are both going to mention Althusser, who I talked about in the last videos. You're also going to see an emphasis on Jacques Lacan in Baudry's essay and in Laura Mulvey's essay. And the other kind of two major thinkers that you are getting are someone like Roland Barthes and Saussure, who are part of a kind of tradition of semiotics and linguistics, or structural linguistics. That's a major part of film theory that we just didn't touch on in this class. But if you're interested, the main figure to be doing kind of Saussurean structural linguistics is Christian Metz. There's a small camp of film theorists who wanted to kind of come up with a quick and dirty label for this kind of film theory. And they took Saussure, Lacan, Althusser, and Barthes. They smashed them together and made an acronym called SLAB. It didn't really catch on. No one really says SLAB theory. But I think it's a good way to remember the kind of film theory that we're reading. If you're interested, it was the film studies professor, David Bordwell, and some of his colleagues who had similar ways of thinking, who came up with this acronym. So I want to very briefly go through a few major points that are in the prologue or the introduction of this essay, Cinema, Ideology, Criticism, before we get to one of the categories that I want to kind of dwell on as a way to explore Sorry to Bother You. So in the beginning, they say in France, and the majority of films, like the majority of books and magazines, are produced and distributed by the capitalist economic system and within the dominant ideology. And they continue. They'll say Godard's recent statement to the effect that he wants to stop working in the system takes no account of the fact that any other system is bound to be a reflection of the one he wishes to avoid. The money no longer comes from the Champs-Élysées, but from London, Rome, or New York. The film may not be marketed by the distribution monopolies, but is shot on film stock from another monopoly, Kodak. So immediately you're getting this idea that making a non-capitalist film is not a matter of alternative sources of funding. That in some way they want to acknowledge the fact, and they don't want to be kind of naive idealists. They want to acknowledge the fact that making a movie is going to be bound to capitalism in some way, because that is the dominant system that organizes the world. And as a medium that requires industrially produced materials like film stock, cinema is inescapably tied to the forces of capitalism. They want to acknowledge that before they move into what they mean. And then they say, but this does not mean that every filmmaker plays a similar role. Reactions differ. It is the job of criticism to see where they differ, and slowly, patiently, not expecting any magical transformation to take place at the wave of a slogan to help change the ideology which conditions them. So they want to say that even though we're acknowledging that there's a kind of a cemented fact of capitalism that films inevitably adhere to, they want to acknowledge that still there are these micro differences, that you can make movies that have different kinds of meanings based on the choices that you're making as a filmmaker, and more importantly, the ways of thinking that you can apply to films as a critic, that is, as someone who does the work of analyzing films of all kinds. So you might say if production were the answer, then there'd be no need for political criticism. This is a defense of the act of political criticism. The third thing that I want to mention is a reflection upon the previous kind of film theory. This is important for us because we're giving a history of film theory so that we can understand what these folks after 1968 are responding to. So I hope this reminds you a lot of the realist film theory of Andre Bazin. So they'll say, clearly the cinema reproduces reality. This is what a camera and film stock are for, so says the ideology. But the tools and techniques of filmmaking are part of quote-unquote reality themselves. And furthermore, reality is nothing but an expression of the prevailing ideology. Seen in this light, the classic theory of cinema that the camera is an impartial instrument which grasps, or rather is impregnated by, the world and its concrete reality is an eminently reactionary one. So they're definitely calling out Andre Bazin and his legacy here. But also they're calling out the very premise that our formalists from early film theory were responding to. Remember how many of our early film theorists took it as a premise that the technology of a camera takes the concrete reality of the world, and then they base their film theory, which is defending film as an art, on that very presumption. These folks are saying that very presumption is a conservative or reactionary one because it ignores the degree to which reality is for them, ideological construction. And to invoke the very notion of reality without acknowledging its status as a ideological construction is to pretend to be without ideology or beyond ideology. So they finish up and they say, what the camera in fact registers is the vague, unformulated, untheorized, unthought out world of the dominant ideology. So I just want to present this argument, and I don't want to present it as correct simply because it comes after the classical film theorists, right? It's not as if because they come later they are automatically correct. As many people have done, in film theory, they have responded to these folks and said that they're actually being rather naive in treating Bazin this way. So I just want to present the tension and then ask you to do the work of kind of formulating your own thoughts about where you might stand in this debate. So that'll do it for this very brief contextualization of this essay and slab theory and cahiers du cinema, and this brief introduction to the first parts of the essay. Next time we'll look in depth at Sorry to Bother You with respect to the category of B, political cinema in both form and content.